So, Module 18 is about imperialism. And really, the big thing we want to understand is what are the motivations for the United States getting involved around the globe? I mean, remember, you have, Washington's farewell address that basically encourages us to be isolationist. The Monroe Doctrine kind of proposed the idea that the U.S. might get involved in other countries. But in practical terms, that was really just more of a kind of a I don't know, a rhetorical device, I guess you could say, than an active policy, right? But what we begin to see as we move into the 1890s is that really changes. The U.S. starts to become engaged in more kind of global affairs. And you could really kind of connect that to kind of the development of industrialization and modern production. And the more that takes off in the United States, the more inclined the U.S. is to focus on kind of global concerns. So if you look at kind of this political cartoon, you can see that it kind of depicts the United States. 1898, this is the year of the Spanish-American War, is really kind of the year that the United States embraces imperialism, right? And really kind of goes, from tip to tip, right? And so you want to kind of remember that year. The American Empire in 1903. You want to be sure that you know the territories that we have control over, which are going to be Guam, the Philippines, most notably. You're going to have Puerto Rico. You're going to have some degree of influence in Cuba. You're going to have Alaska. We're going to have Midway. We're going to have Hawaii, some Wake Island. We've got some other places around there. And so you want to kind of understand that the U.S. has this kind of position, right? And, places like Cuba today, like we still have a complicated relationship with them. And the origin of that complicated relationship comes back to this imperialism. The fact that the United States has kind of this level of control in Cuba until you have Castro coming to power. And so those are going to be things that drive, foreign policy even into the 21st century. Now, one of the issues, too, is whether or not being a world power is good or bad, because being a world power brings with it responsibilities, right? It brings, expense. So you have to have a military, all these kinds of things. And so that's why you want to remember imperialism and kind of this transition to the United States being engaged on the global level. So remember, as we're moving into the 1890s, that the frontier is closed, right? That, basically pretty much everything is settled. Yes, you have a few territories becoming states, but at the same time, right, you have this concern over over what kind of pressure valve are we going to have now, right? How are we going to have places for people to go? How are we going to find new markets? How is the United States going to be able to continue its identity if it doesn't have any place new to go? And then, of course, you've got this issue of overproduction. We're producing lots of agricultural products. We're producing lots of industrial products. Where are we going to sell that? And if the frontier is technically closed, where are we going to have room for people? And of course, remember the problems of urbanization, right? So there's a concern about making the cities even more crowded. You also have driving this a sense of nativism, a sense of cultural superiority. This kind of speaks back to that eugenics idea that I mentioned in the previous section, where you have people thinking that Anglo-American white people are the keepers of civilization, and that anybody who doesn't fit within that racial type, that ethnic type, that somehow they are not as good as we are, and that it is up to us to take civilization to other people. Right? You see this kind of attitude happening a lot in Great Britain and other European countries, where they look down on places in Africa, places in Asia, places in Latin America, and over indigenous populations, and they treat them like they are not the same. right? So it's not unique to the United States, but the United States definitely buys into that narrative of cultural superiority. And so you have this notion of imperialism, and this is true whether it's the United States or Great Britain, which is about economic and political domination, right? These countries are not as strong as us, they're not as developed as us in terms of industrialization, and therefore we can go in and take them over, right? That if we do this, we can control markets, we can have a guaranteed market for our finished products, we can have extract raw materials. We can use all of this and take advantage of this system to make our economy stronger, and maybe this will solve some of the tariff issues, some of the tensions that exist there. And so all of this is happening. It's all supported by the idea of technology. The ability to travel around the globe is increasing, and so that's going to tend to help make things a little bit better. So you have this use of all these qualities of industrialization being put to play in the pursuit of this imperialism, and in some cases it is absolutely taking over a territory and controlling it. In other cases, it's more about maintaining local government, but just basically influencing it, right? The big fancy word for that is hegemony, right? Where essentially, a big country influences a smaller country, kind of like your older sibling would, right? I'm going to tell mom and dad, don't make me come over there and beat you up or whatever. And it's kind of the same principle behind these protectorates and behind the use of hegemony. And of course, this political cartoon definitely depicts the United States, putting on imperialism as though it were getting ready for, for something, right? You can see the steamship right up here with world power expansion as kind of the feather, a sword as her hat pin. Look at her waist; she's got a gun and an artillery box. And so you have kind of this female representation of the United States taking place there. So that's kind of what's interesting. So social Darwinism is, while it's not as popular, certainly among the middle class, but it is still a driving thought. And so you have people that believe that these countries are weaker, and that means they should be taken over, that somehow we're ordained by God to take over weaker countries, and that this is how it was meant to be. You have the notion of Anglo-Saxonism. That's that people, English-speaking, people from England, people of English, Irish, Scottish descent are somehow superior. That culturally they should dominate economically. A lot of this is driven by 19th century British politics and British attitudes, but because the United States really sees itself as part of that, you also have the United States kind of buying into it. And this is kind of layered in with Christianity and with evangelicalism. The idea that other cultures need to be rescued, they need to be saved, they need to be taken care of, their children. We need to go, to Hawaii. We need to go to Guam. We need to, change their lives and teach them a better way, right? And so that's kind of what we see developing. In addition, you have a historical theory that basically says that sea power, that a strong navy is what leads to a strong country. And the premise behind this is Alfred Mahan, and you will want to know his name. Alfred Mahan proposes this idea that and he does this by analyzing history, right? That the reason England became strong and powerful was because it developed its navy, and that having that naval power is what allowed it to become a global power. And he basically suggests that the United States needs to begin to develop that, that in addition to having the strong navy protects trade. You have naval bases as home bases for the Navy, so that allows you to have a footprint all over the globe. Um, and so it really kind of speaks to not only national pride, but it also speaks to economic strength, right? So it becomes very supported in Congress. Teddy Roosevelt, who at this point is still kind of working his way through New York state politics and New York City politics, but he is a huge proponent of Mahan's naval theory, so much so that when he gets into as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, he's going to apply this theory and really help transform the way the Navy operates, right? And this will set us up for the Spanish-American War of 1898. And so all of this is going to be, driven by this concern for markets, and really pretty quickly. I mean, you're talking, after the Civil War. I mean, our Navy was good, but it wasn't great. And by the time you get to 1899, we're the third largest naval power, right? And a lot of these naval ships are based on kind of steam power. So you have kind of new types of warships, new construction, that sort of thing. So that's kind of the background of imperialism, kind of what are some of the factors pushing that. But you also want to understand some of the areas, right? Especially before we get into the Spanish-American War. So you do have the United States becoming increasingly active in the Pacific. This is despite, concerns about Chinese and Japanese immigration. Of course, one of these is going to be the purchase of Alaska from Russia, which is going to be, ties into kind of Russian and Japanese politics, but definitely is a good thing for the United States, considering that we struck gold there in like 1898 and all that kind of stuff. And then, of course, oil and gas now. So you have the purchase of Alaska, you have locations like Midway Island, Samoa, Hawaii, and all of that is an attempt to kind of encourage trade in the Pacific. Remember, China is, and when you're talking about the mid-19th century, China is the place that people want to trade. They want to do business. And the European powers had largely carved up China into spheres of influence. And so what will happen as we're going into the late 1800s, the 1880s, 1890s, is the United States begins to propose an idea called an open door policy. That essentially anybody can trade with China, right? That China should be able to engage with a bunch of different countries, that sure, you can have your port, that's your little sphere of influence, but you should be allowed to trade with them, right? So they're trying to keep China open for the United States trade. So you want to know the open door policy and that it's directly related to that. And of course, this is how you start to have this frustration in China about foreigners, and the Boxer Rebellion. And of course, all of that's going to lead to the United States consistently taking the stance of, we just don't want to mess with China. Right? We just want to have trade with them if we need to, but we don't want to have anything to do with them. We don't want immigration or anything like that. So you have, this is kind of the backstory to the Chinese Exclusion Act and kind of some of the consequences and some of the causations of why that's taking place, right? So keep in mind that this map right here kind of shows you, the European powers pay particular attention to French Indochina. This will be a big factor as we move into the latter part of the 20th century, because this is where Vietnam is. And, India, the role of the British, this will be a big role when you're talking about World War II, as well as the Philippines and New Guinea and this area over here, because Japan will become increasingly a threat as we move into the 1900s. And a lot of that is because they are very resentful of European presence. Japan develops its unique kind of trajectory because it saw what was happening in China. First off, Japan historically had seen itself as superior to other Asian countries like China and Korea. And so they typically didn't see those other countries as equals anyways. And they didn't want to be affected by foreign powers the way they had seen other Asian countries be affected. So they really had very strict border control, right? They basically only opened ports up like twice a year for trade. And even then it was only with the Dutch, and like they were only allowed to be there for 2 weeks. Like it was a very tightly controlled society. But all that's going to change um, when the United States and Commodore Perry sail into what is now Tokyo Bay. And when they sail into Tokyo Bay with these steamships and they fire cannons at Tokyo, Japan goes, "Oh my gosh, like we have fallen behind, right?" And so they sign a treaty that basically allows the United States to begin to trade with Japan. So the U.S. is kind of, kind of one of the first comers to Japan. But what this experience does for Japan is it convinces them they have to modernize, right? So they very quickly embark on this process of industrialization, and they pretty rapidly. I mean, if you consider from 1852 to by the time you get to the 1890s and early 20th century, they are competing for territory. They fight a war with Russia that Teddy Roosevelt then has to negotiate a peace treaty for. Um, Japan starts becoming very interested in taking territory in China, taking territory in Korea. And so they become much more aggressive, right? So they really kind of embrace the idea of imperialism. And part of why they are able to do that is because they are exposed to the technology gap that they had at the middle of the 19th century. But the outcome of this as we move into the 1890s and 1900s is the U.S. is going to be increasingly concerned about the role of Japan and what they're doing in the Pacific. And so the U.S. is going to have a lot more activity, right? Part of why the U.S. is going to want a Panama Canal is in part to facilitate transportation between the Atlantic and Pacific because there are concerns about how powerful Japan is becoming. And in fact, when you get to 1905, Teddy Roosevelt's going to send the U.S. Navy on a tour of the Pacific, which FYI, they sort of kind of still do that. And it's all meant to kind of check the ambitions of Japan, to basically say, we got these big ships, don't make us come use them, right? And so it's kind of meant as kind of a bowing up to Japan. And Japan's kind of like, yeah, okay, we don't want to mess with you, right? You kind of have this uneasy kind of cooperation between the U.S. and Japan. You have this continuation of open door policy in the Pacific. But you want to understand that Japan becomes increasingly imperialistic. And in 1905, the U.S. thinks we kind of have them put in their place, so to speak. But what will happen is by the 1930s, that's not the case. And this is how you start to get to the buildup to Japanese interference in China, ultimately leading to the takeover of Manchuria and the rape of Nanking and some of those things. And basically Japanese aggression in World War II. Right. So this is the backstory to that. So this is the backstory to what happens in World War II. So if we're going to have places in the Pacific, right? If we're going to have all this traffic, if we're going to be going around like that, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have a naval base, right? And so this process actually starts, in like 1870s, and it's really driven in part by by Christian missionaries, right? Who want to kind of rescue, quote unquote, the Hawaiian people. They want to kind of modernize them, make them into something else. And so that what they're doing is they're moving over there. They're trying to Christianize them. But guess what? They find out that Hawaii is good for growing sugar. They find out there's pineapple there. And so you start to have these missionaries that have access to these large plantations, and of course they're taking advantage of this. They're using the Hawaiians as a labor force. So this is kind of the origin story of the Dole Company. Dole Fruit Company has a really sketchy history, not only in Hawaii, but also in Central America with bananas and that kind of thing. So think about that the next time you buy Dole. I encourage you to do a little bit of Google searching on the Dole Fruit Company and kind of how they impacted some of these countries, because it's really quite fascinating. A little out of the scope of what we're doing, a little more in depth than what we're doing here, but Interesting nonetheless. So what will happen in 1875 is, in part because of the development of these sugar plantations, is the U.S. will ratify a treaty with Hawaii that will protect it from tariffs, right? So these planters in Hawaii become increasingly powerful because they're able to sell sugar in large quantities. But as we're moving towards the 1880s, and this treaty agreement over tariffs on sugar is going to expire, what you're seeing is that the planters get very concerned, right? And they want to be sure and control things. Really, what they want is for Hawaii to become a U.S. territory, so that way they can be exempted from the tariff, right? And so these planters will basically take over for the king. They'll try to force him to sign a new constitution. The king will abdicate, and Queen Liliuokalani, his niece, will come to the throne. Now, she had been basically, first off, yes, there was royalty. She had traveled around the world as royalty. She had been educated in the West. She had been educated in Europe, but she's also very proud of being Hawaiian. Right. And she doesn't like what the planters are trying to do. So she tries to force a new constitution to restore power back to the Hawaiian people. What ends up happening is she gets put on house arrest, and then being put on house arrest, she ends up getting forced into signing away, thanks to really what is a coup, right? So you have these planters that reach out to a group of U.S. Marines who had stopped to refuel, and they come in and they basically force her to step down. They create a provisional government, and Grover Cleveland, who was president at the time, really kind of disavowed this action. But what will happen is that once the U.S. gets engaged in the Spanish-American War and begins to take on new territory, what happens is that, why not throw Hawaii in on top of that? So the big conclusion you need to take away from this is that, number one, Hawaii is your classic, Mahan's naval theory. We need a naval base, right? And this is the origin of that. But you also have kind of this story about how these economic interests with these sugar plantations overthrow the historical monarchy of Hawaii, and do so without consulting the native Hawaiians. So there's kind of an ugly story there that, if you ever go to Hawaii, I'm sure you'll find kind of interesting. So it's not a bright spot in American history, and so you want to kind of keep that in the back of your mind. This is a classic picture that shows, the kind of this William McKinley and kind of this forced relationship between the United States and Hawaii, with the U.S. annexing Hawaii. And so into the context of this in 1898, you're going to have the Spanish-American War. And I'm going to have a separate lecture about the Spanish-American War. Just know that it results in more territories, right? We have territories in the Caribbean with Puerto Rico. You have a heavy influence in Cuba. And then you have in the Pacific, you have Guam and you have the Philippines, in addition to our presence in Hawaii. And so all of this encourages more kind of development. And so this kind of brings us to kind of the Panama Canal, which is a part of this period. It's connected to all of this because it has to do with naval power. It has to do with transportation between the Atlantic and the Pacific, and concerns about Japan, and concerns about trade. And it's one of those kind of moments where you have, number one, you have U.S. kind of political intimidation with Colombia, with taking over Panama, which is open to critique. But you also have these great stories of how the United States builds this canal, something that Britain had tried to do, something that France had tried to do, and both of them had given up and said, this is too difficult, right? And so the United States comes in and begins to develop this waterway, a series of locks that kind of move ships back and forth. And this map right here kind of depicts the impact of that. So instead of it taking multiple weeks to go around, you can just cut right across, and it saves so much time. It increases efficiency and all that kind of thing. And so Panama had originally been a part of Colombia, but wanted its independence from Colombia, right? So the Panamanians didn't like belonging to Colombia; they wanted their own country. And so what will happen is that Teddy Roosevelt will reach out to Colombia and offer to buy Panama, and basically Colombia turns them down. Right, and said, "No, this is our place. We want to keep it." Right, and so Teddy Roosevelt then reaches out to the Panamanians, offers them assistance if they will give the United States a canal zone. The U.S. will support Panamanian independence, and of course, his big argument to this is that this facilitates the Great White Fleet and kind of U.S. naval power. And essentially, he does all of this in his position as commander in chief, right? So he doesn't talk to Congress about reaching a treaty agreement. He doesn't talk to Congress about authorizing troops. He just basically does it, right? And in doing so, right, with the U.S. gunships in Panama, Colombia finally says, you know what? Peace out. You can have it. And so you have this Panamanian government that is put in place by the United States. So it's very friendly to the United States. The U.S. has control over the strip that the canal was in, at least until 1999 when the U.S. gave it back. The big thing, sometimes in the STAR test, they ask you questions about the building of the canal. Big thing is it was hugely challenging, right? That they use these series of locks and the different geography. You also have a better understanding of yellow fever. You have a better understanding of malaria, how to control those things, draining swamps, getting rid of stagnant water, that kind of thing. The use of, controlling mosquito populations. So these are some of the outcomes that come from that. And we haven't talked about Teddy Roosevelt as a president yet. We'll talk about that when we get to the progressive period. But know that Teddy Roosevelt comes in as president, and, he had been very much influenced by naval power and that sort of thing. And so when he's president, he's going to advocate this idea that the U.S. and Latin America should work together. And he's going to kind of build on the Monroe Doctrine. And remember, the Monroe Doctrine basically told European powers to step off of the Western Hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine's put in place when a lot of these countries are declaring independence from Spain. And the U.S. says, yeah, Spain, don't interfere. And basically, Spain is super weak. And Great Britain says, yeah, we agree with what the U.S. said. And so it's kind of, like I said, it's a rhetorical device, really. I don't know how effective it is long term, but it becomes very effective when you get to Roosevelt, because he kind of takes the Monroe Doctrine and he expands on it with what is called the Roosevelt Corollary, that essentially says that the United States is kind of the keeper of the peace. And that we need to work with Latin America, right? Getting Latin American countries to buy American-made stuff instead of European stuff, right? And that the U.S. is there to promote stability. So it kind of is a new take on U.S. military force. And of course, all of this is happening about the same time as the Panama Canal, all that kind of stuff. That the U.S. is going to have this big military, we're going to have this big economy, and that because we do that, other countries are going to listen to us and other countries are going to do what we want. And this can pretty well be summed up with the phrase, speak softly but carry a big stick. And then Taft, who's going to succeed Roosevelt, which we'll talk about him more when we get to progressivism, he's going to kind of adapt that policy for less military intervention and focus more on financial investment. So Taft is going to focus more on the economic part. Roosevelt's going to focus more on the military part. But these are terms that you want to be familiar with, particularly in relationship to imperialism and what that looks like, right? Now, one of the problems with the Roosevelt Corollary and dollar diplomacy is that over time, and then you throw in that the Dole Fruit Company, is it will build some bad feelings towards the United States and Latin America. And there'll be kind of this perception that the U.S. tends to meddle in what's going on down there. So you might have heard some of that when President Trump was doing some of his immigration policy stuff, right? This perception that the United States is in part to blame for the economic conditions and the conditions in places like Guatemala and places like Mexico. And that is just one way to look at it. But I think you do need to, at the very least, appreciate that the U.S. has a complicated history back there, and that there are reasons why people would look skeptically at what the U.S. wants to do in Central and South America. And a lot of that is driven by racism. Right. It's driven by perceptions that the United States knows what's best and the United States is superior. Right. So you want to be sure you know about dollar diplomacy and open door policy as it relates to trade. You want to understand that the U.S. rejects isolationism in part because of trade, but also because of Anglo-Saxonism. The U.S. changes its naval policy in part because it believes in Mahan's naval theory and the desire for markets for products, right? And so you want to just keep all of that in mind as we move towards the Spanish-American War. So again, these are all kind of smush bubble concepts. They kind of layer in on top of each other. But by the time we get through with Module 18, you should have a pretty good picture of kind of how these things are building together.